What's the difference between what this train is doing and what this train is doing?
Hey everyone, welcome to a brand new Trains Are Awesome video. I'm Tom, and before we get into the main content today, I just wanted to let you guys know how much I appreciate you. I've been making these videos for a while now. I love doing it because I love trains. But recently, just the number of people that have followed and commented, it's been incredible. And the more people that are involved with Trains Are Awesome, the more exciting opportunities we have to show you trains from all around the world. So if you haven't already, please subscribe to Trains Are Awesome. Follow us on social media where we share pictures and reels of our adventures. And in every video, I do post a link to our Patreon page where you can support us, so definitely go and check that out. Now, on the subject of comments, a few weeks ago I uploaded a video about the Amtrak City of New Orleans and how it leaves Chicago Union Station traveling backwards. Long story short, it reverses out of Chicago Union Station because of how the tracks are laid out in Chicago. It has to connect to a track that'll take it south, and that's the only way to do it. Wow, I could have saved myself a lot of editing. But under that specific video, I got a lot of comments with people saying stuff like, oh, this is very normal, this happens all the time. Examples like Metra, Caltrain, the Amtrak trains in California, etc., etc. And my initial thought was, did you watch the video? Because I say this.
Or they'll use what's known as a cab car. These do not have the power to move themselves, but they do feature a driving cab with the controls for the locomotive. When the cab car is used, the locomotive is pushing.
And what made me laugh was a couple of times I would ask people if they watched the video and they would just admit that they hadn't. But for other people, I think there may have been a genuine misunderstanding, and that's something that I'm going to address in today's video. Because there's a difference between what the City of New Orleans does, which is run backwards, and trains that use cab cars. Cab cars are also known as control cars or driving trailers, depending on what flavor of English you speak. Now, what makes making a video about cab cars so fun is that a lot of different countries use them. So this isn't just an American subject, this isn't just a European subject. Yeah, there's a few countries that don't use them anymore or barely use them anymore, like Japan, but generally this is a very universal topic.
So first, we have to split passenger trains into the two most basic categories, train sets and hauled cars. A train set contains all the necessary equipment to move itself. Both ends have a driver's cab, and the engineer can move the train on its own power from either cab.
So the trains that run in the Chicago L are actually a great example of this. All cars on this train can have passengers in them, but the train moves itself. And up front, the operator is operating the train, but behind me there is also a cab for when the train switches directions.
L trains draw power from an electrified third rail next to the tracks. Usually, train sets are arranged in multiple cars, which we call a multiple unit, but there are plenty of single rail cars that can move on their own as well. Then there are cars that lack the equipment necessary to move themselves. Without something else pulling it, these cars will not move. And that's why we have locomotives. A locomotive is a powerful machine that contains all the equipment necessary to move powerless cars. What's more, they often provide electricity and heat to the cars as well. Of course, most trains don't run in a continual circle, so at some point they're gonna have to switch directions. For train sets, it's easy. Just use the other cab. But what about locomotive-hauled trains? Well, you could move the locomotive to the other side, but this only works if the locomotive is bidirectional, which interestingly, most American passenger locomotives are not. Or you could turn the entire train around, but that requires using special track maneuvers that take up a lot of time and space. You could put a locomotive on both ends, but that's a big investment, doubling the amount of locomotives in your fleet.
Wouldn't it be nice if you could just move the train from the back? Turns out, in some cases, you can. That's what cab cars are all about.
Other names for cab cars include control cars or driving trailers. Basically, they're an unpowered passenger car that contains the controls for the locomotive. Cab cars are placed on the opposite end of the train, and in the driver's cab, the engineer can move the train as if he's in the locomotive. Rather than pulling the train, in this scenario, a locomotive pushes the cars forwards. Cab cars can save a lot of time at terminal stations because the locomotive doesn't have to be detached, then reattached at the other end. Therefore, it's no surprise that they are used in many different countries. The most famous example may be the Austrian Railjet. This train has an electric locomotive at one end, a cab car at the other. It runs at 230 kilometers per hour, or 143 miles per hour, providing premium domestic and international service. My favorite thing about these trains, though, the noise they make. The vast majority of American commuter rail trains use cab cars as well. Several Amtrak routes do too. These include the Keystone Service, the Cascades, and the California state-supported trains. In the future, we can add a lot more trains to this list when the new Arrows come out. The exciting design of the Arrows forces us to acknowledge the elephant in the room here in North America. While European cab cars tend to have aesthetic designs, American cab cars look like somebody just stuck some windows and headlights to the end of a normal car. So how does this all work? Well, unlike your model trains, it's not as simple as just hook up your cars and go. Each car has brakes, which all have to be controlled by the locomotive, and furthermore, locomotives provide the power for the lights, heat, toilets, pretty much everything on all the cars. So locomotives and cars are connected by various different cables. The specific cables that send communications between the locomotive and the cab car are called jumper cables. When a cab car is used, each time the engineer moves a handle, the jumper cables carry that signal through the entire train. The locomotive then interprets that signal as if it came from its own controls and responds accordingly. As you can imagine, it's really important that the cab car and locomotives are compatible. The Dutch found this out the hard way. For decades, their ICR intercity cars had been working with old Dutch and Belgian electric locomotives. However, in 2013, the Dutch railways leased new Trax locomotives built by Bombardier. I have a video giving a more detailed explanation of why they got those locomotives, so be sure to click on the link and check that out. Anyways, mechanics tried to get the cab cars to work with the Trax locomotives, but they ultimately did not succeed. They decided to buy extra locomotives and run each train with a locomotive on both ends. Now we've talked about what cab cars are and how they work, let's talk about some interesting examples. Once again, in the Netherlands, in the early 1990s, they built the DDAR double-deck passenger cars. These had a cab car and were pulled or pushed by a locomotive. However, starting in 1996, special cab cars with motors on the bottom floor were built and attached to these cars instead, converting them from locomotive-hauled trains to train sets. You can still ride these today, and I personally love sitting in the car with the motors because of the noise it makes. In Germany, the ICE2 trains actually use a cab car on one end and a power car on the other. This is another example of the technology being applied to a higher speed train. In the United States, Amtrak does something very similar to a cab car. They're called NPCUs, which stands for Non-Powered Control Unit. This is when they take an old locomotive, remove the engine, and put it on the back of a train to act as a cab. It no longer provides power of its own, but it can be used to control the train in the other direction, just like a cab car, but without passenger seating areas. I believe that Amtrak is currently in the process of converting their old HHP-8 electric locomotives into NPCUs for services like the Vermonter. I don't know what the progress on that is, though. So, finally back to the city of New Orleans. Why is this different? Well, that train doesn't use a cab. For the short section it runs backwards, the conductor is on the radio with the engineer, who is at the controls of the locomotive. Meanwhile, we've established that with cab cars, the engineer is seated in the cab car itself, and so while it may look like metro trains are running backwards, actually, they're not. Thank you so much for watching today. If you learned something new or if you just liked seeing all the trains, please subscribe to Trains Are Awesome. We'll see you next time.